Hi, ladies. I didn't see a car. Welcome, Father Patrick and Luke, Kent.
We've got a good representation of our ACC, right, Father? Right.
Perfect. And then David, welcome, David. Oh, there's the other Jessica, our two Jessicas.
Give it one more minute, not quite at one, and then I'll go ahead and start.
Welcome to you, Anne. I see you there, Anne.
All right. Looks like most people are popped on. Maybe a few more will pop on in a few minutes as we get a little past one. Thank you all for coming back. Looking forward to an exciting discussion on, it looks like the Fair Labor Standards Act, which I know we've had many conversations in different venues about this law, which is very important in the church. So we're excited to welcome back Richard to lead our class today. I'm just going to start us off with prayer. But just as a reminder, if you have a question, make sure you unmute yourself, but when you're not speaking, to keep muted just to reduce background noise so everyone can hear the speaker. All right. I'm going to do a shorter prayer today because I don't know how much capacity I have to speak for long periods today. So, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, send the Spirit of your Son to remain with us during our class. Let him guide us and inspire us to think and speak according to the mind of Jesus. Fill us with your love and joy and help us to put our plans into practice. Amen.
Amen.
And I'm going to hand it over to Regina to do her welcome.
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. And I'm so excited to have all of you here today for our third class. But before we get into today's class, I have a question about last week's class that Carol Fowler presented. And here's my question. One sentence. Share how your workplace is more pastoral based on Carol's class. One sentence, a short sentence in chat. Share how your workplace is more pastoral because of Carol's message last week. Here we go.
Jessica says fostering a culture where people matter. David shares that he doesn't have an answer just yet. Not invoking employment at will from Father Patrick.
That was
Looking at HR through the lens of the church combines faith and management, which in my mind were kind of always separate until our class last week,
Oh,
says
great.
Pam. Alexia says checking in with each individual employee to see how they're doing. Janice said we scheduled a much needed cluster staff meeting. Way to go. And Lisa says serve the people of God and promote the gospel. From Anne, we are implementing prayer time together at lunch to make the workplace more positive and doing things together. And Amanda says trying to make the staff meetings more productive, not just to meet. Those are great.
Yes, they are. I love the idea of the staff meeting. What a great opportunity to build community and your relationship with God as well. So thank you. Now, today we have a fantastic session all lined up for you. Our aim is for you to feel not only inspired, but also well-informed about fair labor standards and the HR challenges associated with that implementation. As you participate in the session, I encourage you to ponder this question. How do you envision incorporating these concepts and ideas into your HR responsibilities moving forward? So please feel free to ask any question or share thoughts throughout our time together in the chat and at various times when Richard will stop for questions and comments, and especially at the end. So let's make this a fun and interactive learning experience together. So Richard, take it away.
Thank you, Regina. Welcome, everybody. My pleasure again being with you. Hopefully I can share some experiences with you and a very important topic coming up. Now, before that, I just want to take a very brief moment to review the pretest that you had taken, just to give you an idea where we are. We had 17 respondents altogether, and I did a couple of changes. I eliminated one question, which was question 15, because I had the wrong answer on there. And then on another one, number 17, it says the process in which leaders provide a rationale for each employee's performance appraisal, rating, and follow with a discussion to ensure rating alignment is called. The correct answer was actually very simple. It was feedback. However, a lot of people put down assessment, which I accepted either answer. So those are the two changes that I did to that pretest. Now, the good news is we do have 3 individuals that got 95%, meaning they only missed one. Jessica Goebel and speaks to her position in HR. Then we have Todd Wentworth, 95% as well, and Pam Pundak, Parish Administrator, 95%. So all 3 of those did great work on this one. So congratulations and thank you for participating. Any questions on that? Yeah, I can't hear you, Regina. I think you're
Richard,
muted.
and when will their gift arrive?
What's that?
When will their gift arrive?
Oh, that's going to be in the mail, like everything. It's like the check in the mail.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on. Unless anybody has some questions, we're going to move on to the presentation. So if you'll bear with me a second, we'll get with that. Can everybody see that? Okay, all right. Well, listen, again, this is basically an introduction to human resources in the church workplace. This is a collaborative project, and I mention it again, between the Diocese of St. Cloud and the National Association of Church Personnel Administrators, which An organization, as I think we previously mentioned, has been extremely important in the church and has done a lot of work over the years. So it's an excellent partnership that we've established with the Diocese of St. Cloud. Hopefully, you'll recognize some benefit from it. So moving on, we're going to talk about the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is a large part of the human resources puzzle and one area that brings on a lot of questions throughout a person's career in human resources, or even if you're not a human resources professional, even if you're in the fringes of it, questions come up, especially in your situations in the different parishes, different organizations. So moving on, to start out with, whenever you bring a new employee onto the workplace, whether that's a new employee or somebody transfers over to rehire, questions always come up from the individuals, such as overtime. Am I going to be paid overtime? What about rest periods? How about extra pay? How can I make a little extra money? What about holidays and vacations? Am I entitled to that? Will I get any? What's my position? Is it exempt or is it non-exempt? What about my minimum pay? How much is that going to be? Other areas that people have questions on is travel. Sometimes some positions require some travel, whether it's local or extensive. Also, along with it, what about the meals? Do we pay for the meals? Who has to pay for that? And the last question is, I'm a parishioner. I work for the parish, and I also want to do some volunteer work. Can I do that? So those are questions that come up periodically in our workforce. Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in 1938. The purpose when it was established was to correct the poor working conditions that existed in the U.S. It regulates the hours of work, eliminates substandard pay through minimum wage requirement, and encourage employers to hire more workers by increasing cost of overtime work. Those of you who are history buffs and have had a study of the history of industries in the U.S., particularly if you've read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and other documentations, you know that the conditions of work were pitiful rather, around the turn of the century. We had 8, 9-year-olds working on the stockyards, working in the different industries in the coal mine industries, which was something of an abuse of children at that time. So this is one of the other reasons that the Fair Labor Standard was passed. Today it is federal law and it applies to full and part-time employees. Nobody's left out. It requires a minimum wage. It requires premium pay for overtime and, very important, child labor protection, which we no longer have, and where we have it, it's very limited. Record keeping and posting requirements. Now, I kid you not, the law is complicated. There are many aspects and scenarios to consider, so as you go along, you run into these situations. The Fair Labor Standards Act is administered by the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division. Any questions so far? Okay, what is not required? There's a lot of misconceptions in the workplace as to what is required in the workplace. And if you look at the Fair Labor Standards Act, it does not require vacation pay or time off for holidays or vacation, surprisingly enough. Does not require severance pay when employee leaves or terminated. Does not require meal or rest periods. Limits on the number of hours employees over 16 years of age can work. No requirement there. There's no requirement for premium pay or double time for weekend, night, or holiday work. Does not require wage payment or collection procedures for employee wages. Does not require shift differentials, pay raises, or fringe benefits. Does not require discharge notice or immediate payment of final wages. And also, surprisingly, it does not require pay stubs or W-2s. So the question that employees have a lot of times that in the workplace is, I know my rights and I know what I can expect from my employer. And according to federal law, I'm entitled to all these benefits. But what they don't realize that a lot of these are not required Fair Labor Standards, Mostly they come into being because of union contracts and also the benevolence that we have, especially in our church, where we want to give the employees as many benefits as we can. So these are all things that come into being in the individual workplaces versus dictated by federal. A lot of them are dictated by state law as well. So there's a conglomeration of requirements that come into being over time. So it varies, and a lot of times it varies from state to state. Anybody have any questions on this aspect? Okay. Who is covered? The Act broadly defines both employers and employees covered. It covers an employer who has at least 2 employees who produce work on or handle goods involved in interstate commerce. For example, regular use of the mail, telephones, email for interstate communications. This is a very simple and sometimes what might appear to be a silly aspect of this, but this involves even coverage because we order, an example is ordering paper in our situation. You order a stack of paper, that's all transported via interstate carriers. That brings that into the focus. So anything that's basically covers every aspect of our lives anymore. It's not like it used to be years ago when things were transported from one location to another via wagon or so forth. Now everything is electronic, it's instantaneous, and it's in throughout the nation in a variety of carriers. It has a gross annual sales or business volumes of at least $500,000. I don't know of any parish that does it, that operates on less than that. It does cover preschools, elementary and secondary schools, and institutions of higher education. Covers cemeteries with annual revenues of $500,000. Domestic service workers such as day workers, housekeepers, chauffeurs, cooks, or full-time babysitters. And our history tells us that these are the areas where in the past there have been a lot of abuse, people taken advantage of. Well, the Fair Labor Standards does cover these folks. It covers virtually every employer, including the Diocese of St. Cloud and any other diocese in the nation. So any questions on these so far? Okay. Workers not covered. Although the Act covers most employees, there are some that are specifically left out. One is elected officials and staff, and this is in the government aspect, state or federal government. They're not covered by this Act. Independent contractors, trainees, and volunteers, and we'll get into that aspect a little bit. The exception, volunteers are covered if the individual volunteers perform their same services for which paid, and the individual is in any way pressured or coerced into performing volunteer activities. Other specific and partial exemptions, meaning law enforcement and first responders as an example. Now, while we're on the subject, going back to the individual volunteers, anybody have a comment or not understand that aspect? Feel free to don't be shy. Tell us what your thoughts are.
Richard, I have a question. It might be, backing up a little bit. And this is the question. I wish we could be given more specifics on these required items in regard to the state of Minnesota, their laws, especially when they are different from federal requirements.
Well, there are differences by state. Okay, every state has a different variety of requirements, but right now we're addressing the federal requirements. So these will vary by state. Arizona has a different, Minnesota is different, California is altogether different from anybody else in the country. And so we all have to, well, I say roll with the punches by the state. So this is something that, aside from the federal requirements, really need to focus on what the state requirements are. For example, salary, we'll talk about salary requirements. And although the federal requirements that are one state, there's some, if the state supersedes that, the amount that's required is what the state requires. So that's how that interacts. So I hope I answered your question, Regina.
No, I think they wanted examples from their state. So maybe Bailey could jump in with some samples.
Yeah, I guess I'm I'm not sure what specific required items we're looking for. I think maybe as we go forward,
Yeah,
there will be some examples of some state laws. Right
Yeah.
now, everything we've covered under FLSA is just the general FLSA rules that apply to everybody, and there's not really any different specifics for our state so far that I've seen.
Thank you. That's the point here. We got to cover the federal, and then we'll get into the specifics. But that's individual versus something that people would have an opinion on as we go into this one. So
Yeah,
let's
thank
stick.
you.
Okay, so moving on. Uh, Department of Labor regulations implemented in August of 2004 brought on two classifications. The first one is an exempt classification, which very simply means exempt from overtime requirements, that is, salaried personnel. Exempt personnel are paid on a salary basis, paid a predetermined amount each pay period, the established minimum per the Department of Labor. Pay cannot be reduced because of variations in quality or quantity of work. Must receive full salary in a week in which the employee performs any work without regard to the number of days or hours worked, and the employee need not be paid for the work week in which the employee performs no work. For example, if we go into the exempt classification, the Department of Labor has a certain amount that's required, and that has to be a predetermined amount each pay period. From there, that cannot be reduced, and I repeat this because this is an area of misconception a lot of times. Pay cannot be reduced because of variations in quality or quantity of work. Every once in a while, you find a manager that says, well, my employee's not really performing, therefore I'm not going to pay him the full salary for the period of time that he's goofing off, if you will. Also, if the employee is not producing the quantity of work that's desired, that's also something that cannot be reduced. That's addressed in another area under performance management, but under the Fair Labor Standards Act, pay cannot be reduced because of variations in quality or quantity of work. Very important, must receive a full salary in the week in which the employee performs any work without regard to the number of days or hours worked. This is an area that can be a little misinterpreted on occasion, but basically it says that if you have an employee that comes into work and works 1 hour, that employee needs to be paid for the full day. Sometimes people don't understand that. And this is the reception of full salary in the week, regardless of whether the employee works the full week or not. Employee need not be paid for the work week in which the employee performs no work. So if employee takes off, it's under their control. They don't work, they don't have to be paid. Any questions so far on that part? Okay. Moving on to non-exempt. Non-exempt, again, is not exempt from overtime requirements. For example, these are hourly workers. That can be the janitor, it can be a receptionist, it can be an administrative assistant. That person is paid on an hourly basis. Must be paid a minimum wage, whether it's a federal or state minimum. And this is where the variations come in by state. And each state has its different wage requirements. Must be paid 1.5 times the hourly rate past 40 hours in a week. There's no exception to that. Now, each state varies as well. In the state of California, for example, it's 1.5 times the hourly rate past 8 hours in a day versus 40 hours in a week. So that changes the picture a little bit. Person cannot volunteer time for doing the same type of work. An example of this is you have a parish administrative assistant or a secretary puts in a full 40 hours, and then the pastor says, or you as the office manager or business manager say, I need you to come in and take the minutes for the parish council meeting tonight, and the employee works an extra 2 hours. That has to be compensable. That is time and a half for those 2 hours of work that the person has. So the person cannot say, well, I'll volunteer my time. The pastor cannot say, will you volunteer your time to take the minutes? As long as that work is the same as what that individual does each and every day. Okay. Questions on that particularly? That's one that's a stumbling block sometimes. Does anybody have any questions on that one? Okay, the last item is an employee cannot wait their overtime requirements. The employee cannot come to you or to the pastor and say, well, don't pay me because I'm going to work this weekend fiesta doing, what I'm doing regularly, but I'll sign a paper that says I'll waive my overtime requirement. That is illegal. You cannot do that. Okay. Questions?
I would just throw in that this is something I get a lot of questions about, that like volunteering for the parish, like that seems to be a really messy thing.
Yeah.
And employees, it's usually that the employee really wants us to do that. And so that's always the biggest struggle is like, but they
Yeah,
want to do that. And it's like, I know they do, but so just, I know, I'm sure most of you have come up against this. If you haven't yet, I'm sure that you will sometime because this is a very popular one.
I've yet to hear of a parish not running into that situation. And basically, the stock answer to something like that is a person can volunteer, but it has to be something that's beyond what their normal work requirement is. An example would be if a parish secretary is asked to work the fiesta and she's asked to man one of the booths, two different situations, not the same thing as what she does during the week. However, if the individual takes in money, for example, for candles or whatever at the parish as part of her job, then she's asked to take money in for the fiesta. Now all bets are off. Now that person is doing what is considered an extension of their job. So that overtime requirement does kick in. But this is a stumbling block for a lot of people. As a manager in a parish, for example, it's very difficult for you to say, no, I can't allow you to do it because you do need the help. This is where you have to garner your resources and think a little bit out of the box and say, okay, if you want to help the fiesta, then I'm going to put you doing something different than what you do during the day. One very, very common violation is with our custodial crews because they perform custodial duties during the week. Then during the time of the fiesta, they're asked to come in and pick up all the trash that happens. That's an extension of the job. Another example. So any
Um,
other questions on that?
Richard, I have two in the chat here. And the one is, what if they are non-exempt but paid on a salary basis?
Yeah, if they're non-exempt but paid on a salary basis, the same rationale applies. You have to convert it to an hourly basis. They still are required to pay overtime. The fact that they're paid on a salary basis is immaterial. They still need to be considered the overtime factor because they're non-exempt. The difference is now, if you're a non-exempt, you can be paid on a salary basis, which means you get paid an X dollar amount each week. However, that needs to be equated to an hourly wage.
Oh, that's
So,
good.
and that's where the misconception comes in sometimes. So the answer to that is they're still subject to overtime requirements.
And
What's the other? Let's see.
another question, Richard, can non-exempt employees waive being paid mileage?
That depends on the parish. The mileage is something that's their responsibility to pay into the parish. They cannot waive it. If they request it, it has to be paid. But again, let me give you an example. In any parish, you have individuals that are going to drive down to the store. They're not going to bother with putting in the mileage. But if they requested it, yes, it has to be paid. They cannot waive. That cannot be waived. You have to pay it. That answer your question? Any other questions?
I hope that helped, Bethany.
I'm sorry?
I was just saying, I hope Bethany wrote that question. I was hoping that
Yeah.
helped.
Are you okay with that, Bethany?
Yes, thank you, she says.
Okay, all right. Any other questions?
Yeah, Richard, this is David Badger.
Yeah.
Your example about the festivals, um, if it's required that an hourly employee be at the festival, but there's really no set specific task other than it's a being present kind of thing.
That's a different situation. If
Yeah.
they're
If they're
there, not doing specifically what they do during the week, I don't think that's an issue. You just need to be careful they're not confined to doing the same
right,
tasks they do during the week. A
because
lot,
But they're required by you as a staff member to be there?
yes, that's my point.
ah,
Is we're
okay, that's
requiring them to be
that's
there, but
that's
they're not performing anything on their job description.
no, if they're required to be there, okay, regardless what the position is, that changes the picture. Then they need to be paid overtime.
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
anytime that management makes that request of our employee, that puts the onus on the employer to pay that individual overtime.
Yep.
Okay, no, if the
Or
individual,
for their time. Yeah.
right, yes, correct. Questions? This is a stumbling block in a lot of areas, as Bailey said, and that continues to be a stumbling block for a lot of parishes. It will continue forever and ever, I'm sure. But to the extent that we can spread this information and get people thinking in the right direction, that should be something that would overcome. Now, the downside here is should there be a complaint to the Department of Labor, now you've got all sorts of problems. This is why we need to be careful as or as the managers in a parish uh, that is not violated, because all it takes is one complaint to the Department of Labor, and you've got a lot of explaining to do. And I think that's the biggest message we can make. Okay, what color exemptions? Next. These are the executive, administrative, and professional categories. Okay. It includes outside sales, skilled computer employees. And for these, the employee is paid at least a certain compensation. The employee is paid on a salary rather than an hourly basis. And the employee performs certain exempt duties, which we'll get into. So just remember that these are covered include executive, administrative, and professional employees. There are 2 required tests for executive classification. Now, when I say executive classification, this basically means those that are managing in the parish. Although they may not be classified executives, but if you're the business manager, for example, you fall into that category. So that is what is required under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the minimum salary text. Now, this is where this is going to get a little bit confusing because there's been some changes in recent times that have changed the picture regarding minimum salary. If all of you have been around for a while, for many years, we had a minimum exempt salary of $23,660. As long as you made that salary, you could work full time to put in how many hours of the week you wanted without having to pay overtime. Now that changed in 2024. Okay. Now the minimum for an exempt person is $844 a week or 43,888 a year. And that changed as of July 1 of 2024. Now this is something that has been controversial, unpopular in many areas, because that has had an impact now, especially in our parishes, because if you have an individual who is not paid that amount, then you have to pay overtime. So anybody paid less than this has to be paid on an hourly basis, basically converted to non-exempt. Any questions on that? Okay, moving on. There's no extra pay if you qualify for exempt pay. You do not get any extra pay for work on weekends. You're expected to work when duty calls. In other words, this is a true test for exempt employees. Now, something to look forward to or just to be aware of, that there is a change pending or January 1st of 2025 to 1,128 a week or 58,656 a year. At that time, if the person does not reach that amount, again, they're going to have to be converted to non-exempt, and overtime requirements come into being. Now, this is being challenged in some states. So is there a chance that it might change? I don't know. But right now, that's what's projected for January 1st of 2025. To some, this is a surprise and it's a problem because all of a sudden we have parishes who are having to convert to hourly employees. They're having to pay way more than they had to before in overtime work. So this is again something that was unexpected, not necessarily popular for nonprofit organizations, but we have it and that's faced. Any questions on that at this point in time? Okay, no. Required test for executive classification. Again, the duties test. The salary is one test, but then you also have a duties test if you're in executive position. Executive classification has a primary duty of management, which means the direction of work of 2 or more employees. That person has the authority to hire or fire employees or make recommendations as to employee status changes are given particular weight. An example of this, if you have, for example, in your parish, you have the business manager who is managing the workforce. That individual has the authority to hire or fire employees. However, that sometimes is limited because the pastor has to make the final decision. However, the pastor normally uh, falls to the recommendation of the business manager or the office manager, be that the case. So that individual still is in a position of manager, directs the work of 2 or more employees, does have the authority to hire or fire employees, but if not, then can make recommendations to the pastor as to what should take place. Any questions on that? That can be a little bit confusing if you don't get it right. Okay, moving on. Excuse me, executive continued. The management responsibilities for this position is interviewing, selecting, training of employees, setting and adjusting rates of pay and hours of work, directing the work of employees, appraising employees, and handling employee complaints and grievances. This is normally what an example is, again, the business manager. This is what the requirements are. Now we get into administrative exempt. Now, these are the folks that are on the firing line doing administrative duties. They're responsible for doing non-manual work in the office, for example. You're talking about your administrative assistants, executive assistants, folks of that nature that have non-manual requirements or non-manual duties, but it's very valuable work that they do. They're also paid on a salary basis, again, at the July 1st, 2024 rates. That applies to them as well. Now, again, we have to consider the increase in January 1st, 2025. The employees in this category are responsible for making decisions and performing activities directly related to the management of the organization. Now, stop and think for a second, because you have an administrative assistant or you have the office manager's assistant. Employees are responsible for making decisions and performing activities directly related to the management of the organization. Okay? The employee has a primary duty of performing office or non-manual work. This is a big difference, okay? For example, St. Claude Director of Religious Education, Benefits Administrator, Formation Director, Parish Business Manager, Office Manager, etc. Those are the ones that fall into the administrative exempt possibly, okay? The person must be able to exercise discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. The job title alone is not sufficient, is insufficient to establish an exempt status. Now, going back a little bit here, this is a person that we rely on, particularly in the parish and small organizations, to do a lot of the work that in a larger organization, a bona fide manager in exempt capacity would handle. Now we have an individual that we're dependent on to handle all these situations. So we give that individual the ability to exercise discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. Let me give you an example. You have a pastor, you have a parish, and you have a business manager. All of a sudden, they're all gone. Vacation, pastor's out doing his pastoral duties, the business manager's out taking care of business for the parish. Now you have an administrative assistant who you've classified as exempt. This is a person that's very trusted, been around for a long time, that's very capable. That person is now exempt. You're paying that person the right salary. Okay. No, that person may need to make a decision at some point in time in the absence of the pastor or the business manager, which is significant. So what does that mean? Discretion and independent judgment means, for example, can commit the parish or the organization in matters of significant financial impact or negotiate and bind on significant matters. Let me give you a very simple example based on what I just said with the absence of the business manager and or the pastor. Plumbing goes out. All of a sudden you have to call the plumber, and that's a significant repair service that needs to be done. Nobody's around, you have to make a decision. So does that person have the ability to make a judgment and commit the parish to pay for the services? And the answer in that would be yes. No. The person can waive or deviate from policies and procedures without prior approval. That is true to a degree. Now, in these instances, the pastor normally would come in and say, well, review that. So the person can make those commitments, but with post-review by the pastor. Okay. The individual is involved in planning business objectives, investigates and resolves matters of significance, handles complaints, arbitrates disputes, or resolves grievances. Okay. Any questions on the administrative exempt?
Yes,
Most-
I have one here in the chat, Richard.
Okay.
The hours worked for an exempt employee can be less than 40, but is there a certain number of hours that must be worked each week to be exempt?
No, that depends on the organization. Okay, some judge their or classify their employees as exempt and don't require them to work 30 hours, 35 hours. That depends on the organization. The Fair Labor Standards establishes that amount at the 40-hour level. So as long as that person doesn't exceed the 40 hours, you're okay. A person can be exempt if they work only 30 hours.
Oh, okay.
Not always the best course of action to take. I always dispute that because you're basically paying them less than what their value is. But the answer to that question is it does not have to be a full 40 hours. No.
And another question, Richard, it has to deal with job description change. What if a person was hired as a full-time secretary / bookkeeper who would be non-exempt, but is now a full-time office manager moving to exempt? Does there need to be a new job description and basically a change across the board?
Basically, yeah, the answer to that is true. Now, first of all, going back to the job description, I would never hire somebody with a dual responsibility. Okay, it should be just one top title because, and we'll get into that when we get into performance management because it's very difficult to evaluate a person who has a dual job title. But anytime you hire somebody into one position and all of a sudden you have a change, yes, that job description has to come in to be appropriate for that particular position for which that change came about. So now you have an office manager and that job description should be the fitting or relative to that position as an office manager.
Okay.
Next question.
I don't see any more here in the chat, unless somebody has one they'd want to present.
Feel free to speak up. You don't have to use the chat if you don't feel comfortable with it, by the way. Okay, moving on. Professional employees. This is another area of confusion sometimes. Professional employees compensated as an exempt employee. This includes learned professionals. The teachers are learned professionals. Then you have creative professionals, which are artists, musicians, and writers. Now, there's one glitch to that, and that person, to be a creative professional, must have received specialized training. For example, accredited school of music, like the Juilliard School of Music, if you're going to be a musician. In other words, the local guitar player cannot be classified as a creative professional. There's a lot of misconception in this, and I've had arguments with business managers on this over the past years, but that's according to the Fair Labor Standards Act. Questions on that particular part? Okay, computer professionals, okay, systems analysts or programmers, highly compensated employees. Now, these I cannot conceive of a parish necessarily, or even the diocese, having too many highly compensated employees, but they perform the duties of an executive, administrative, or professional employee and earns more than 132K per year. In January of 2025, that would jump to 151,000. That's the salary threshold for a highly compensated employee. You will find these in large corporations, private corporations, where you have those positions, but I've yet to see a diocese that would justify or be able to afford somebody in that position. Outside sales employees, the primary duty is making sales or obtaining orders, customarily and regularly away from the employer's place of business. This is particularly important where it says customarily and regularly away from employers' place of business. One area that you run into a stumbling block is with cemeteries, for example, where they have outside sales employees. Sometimes they have their outside sales employees in the office making sales with their clients who happen to come in, and they classify them as exempt. That does not work. In order for them to be outside sales employees, they have to be out away from the workplace, basically soliciting sales and soliciting business. Any questions on this? Okay. Deductions to salary. I brought this subject earlier about not reducing a person's salary. However, full week deductions if the employee performs no work is totally acceptable. However, the personal absences must be under the employee control. The employee says, I'm going to take a week off. I'm an exempt employee, and you can dock in for that work for that entire week. It must be in full day increments only. For example, if a person misses a Monday and works 4 days and it's under their control, you can deduct that one full day from their salary. Sickness or disability. If a compensation plan is in place for loss of salary for sickness or disability, in other words, workers' compensation kicks in because of an injury or an illness, then the person does not have to be paid during that time. There's no deductions if willing and able to work, but absence is not within employee's control. A very vivid example is natural disasters, for example, or you have an outage locally that the computers don't work. If the employee is able to come to work, then that employee has to be paid. You cannot deduct that pay from him. This includes jury duty, temporary military leave. You cannot deduct the wages for jury duty. Normally, what happens in those cases, you ask the employee to turn in their jury duty pay, which normally they will receive it, but you still pay them the full salary. Temporary military leave, the same thing. Okay. No deductions for personal time off during the workday. Now, This last item is extremely important because this is where there's controversy that comes up on occasion. A person who is an exempt person, if that person needs to take a couple of hours of personal time to handle some business, that's perfectly acceptable. That person still needs to be paid the entire day. Okay. You cannot discriminate and deduct half a day pay, for example, and I've had that happen on occasion, but it's unacceptable. Questions on that?
I have one here about that professionalism. Um, Would a bachelor's degree in music qualify for a creative professor?
No,
Professional, rather, professional.
not unless an individual has undergone specialized musical training. And that can be through a bona fide music school that has a certificate issued to that. But my bachelor's degree, let me give you an example. I have a bachelor's degree. I pick up my guitar and I go play for the parish. That does not make me a professional in that category. Okay.
So Richard, I have, again, this David Badger, I have a question about the last bullet.
Yes, go ahead.
So if in our situation, our parish, we don't have PTO, but we have vacation time, personal time, and sick time.
Mhm.
And the way I read that, I'm sitting here questioning why, for our exempt staff, we have a personal time bucket.
Again, two different situations. What you have is a benefit that you allowed or that you're providing for an employee. That's if it's personal time off, that means that person can take time off anytime, whether it's vacation or sick leave. Okay. Now, in this particular case, let's say the employee has to go to the bank and says, I need to go to the bank, I need to go take some personal business. That takes it out of the PTO time and the vacation time. So that's the very simple example of that happening. So in that cases, that person will still need to be paid the full day. Now, if that person says no, I've got some personal business that I'm going to take some personal time off, different situation. Now you've got a situation where you can deduct pay for that personal time. Okay, make sense?
Yeah, I heard in your description a little bit of a mix of terminology. So I just want to maybe clarify again. So we do not have PTO policy.
Yeah, PTO
We have
policies.
we have vacation bucket,
Yeah,
sick time bucket, and personal time bucket.
yeah. See, on a personal level, my personal opinion, and I know have arguments against this. Personally, I'm not in favor of PTO. Okay, the reason for that can be very easily abused. It's very a lot more productive and a lot more clear if a person has X number of vacation days, X number of sick days that that person can rely on. But if I have PTO and I say, well, I'm going to take PTO for whatever reason,
Right.
and that reason may not necessarily be because that person is ill or whatever, you
Right.
cannot take any action against that person. They can take it off for whatever reason they want.
Yep, understand that piece. My point of the question, and maybe I'll state it one more time, and then maybe just let it go. We don't have PTO.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I thought you said you had. Okay.
No, we have a vacation bucket,
Mm-hmm.
a sick time bucket, and
Mm-hmm.
a personal time bucket. And my question is, based on that last bullet, why would I have the personal time bucket?
If you have personal time bucket, that puts in a different category. I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question. Then this may not necessarily apply as long as you've got enough personal time in that personal time bucket to be able to allow it. But let's say that person has already used that personal time bucket.
Right.
Now you get into a situation where you still have to pay that full salary of the person, the employee has to take some time.
That's exactly my point. So why even have it?
Yeah.
And you don't have to answer it. It's
Mhm.
more of a,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
something
Great
for us,
question.
It's
something for us
always,
to
Yeah, that's always brings up a lot of questions in that situation, particularly with personal time off.
Yep, you hit on exactly the point I was getting at, so thank you.
Mhm. Right. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Permitted for disciplinary reasons. For unpaid disciplinary suspensions of 1 or more full days for infraction of workplace conduct rules. Well, this is entirely acceptable. You can deduct salary if you suspend a person for, say, 3, 5 days, whatever. Okay. Now, however, the suspension must be pursuant to written policy applicable to all employees. That means that a manager cannot just arbitrarily say, I'm going to put you on suspension for 3 days and I'm not going to pay you. If you have something that's written that applies to all employees, not a problem, but it has to be written and applied to all employees. Examples of some of these deductions or some of these suspensions would be sexual harassment, violence, drug or alcohol violations, violations of state or federal laws. Questions? Okay. Hours worked versus compensation. Time spent for the benefit of the employer must be compensated. And this, for example, is travel when it's integral to the performance of a job. If the employer expects the person to travel, then that time spent needs to be paid for that travel. For example, and an example like that is I've asked an employee to take a trip to wherever, and that employee is going to start at 7 a.m. tomorrow morning, has to travel all day till 5 p.m. I need to pay that employee for the time. I do not pay for that employee for normal dinner time or for sleep time, but I do have to pay the employee for that travel time. Any time that I expected of an employee, I have to be prepared to pay for that travel. Commuting time is not compensable. Commuting time means going from home to work. That is not compensable. However, if I have my regular commute time is from home to the diocese, for example, to the parish, and all of a sudden I've asked to go somewhere else tomorrow morning, not my normal workplace, because I have to attend business at another parish or at the diocese, then that's no longer commuting time. That's not compensable. Meal periods need not be compensated if they're 30 minutes or longer, and the employee is relieved of all duties during meal time. This was a bit troublesome because a lot of times in organizations, people like to eat at their desk. Need to be careful with that. Rest periods are not mandatory, but advisable. Let me go spend some time on this particular situation. First of all, meal periods, sometimes it's convenient for an employee. They feel they're very busy. They want to just eat at the desk. However, if they're eating at the desk, then we need to pay them for that time that they're eating. We cannot dock that 30 minutes from their pay. The employee needs to be relieved of all duties during that meal time. On the other one, rest periods are not mandatory but advisable. Now, again, according to the Act, you're not required to provide rest periods, but logically speaking, my advice would be you got to give an employee the time necessary to take that. I'm not an advocate of saying you have 15 minutes at 10 a.m. and you have 15 minutes at 2 p.m. In my opinion, not necessarily reasonable. You have to, and this now we're getting into an employee relations situation. You have to be a little bit flexible in that regard. So rest periods are not mandatory but advisable when, in my opinion, whenever the employee feels they have a need to do it. Okay. Questions on these?
I have a question here in the chat, Richard. It's
Mhm.
about a substitute priest. So I had a parishioner ask if we should be paying for a sub-priest mileage to commute from their residence to the church.
That is something that is out of the Fair Labor Standards Guide. That's a priest. Now, that's something that's dictated based on the requirements of the diocese. That's not something that we would enter into because they're not really classified as an exempt, non-exempt, and so forth. technically, if you want to apply it, they're executive employees, but then again, not necessarily. So that takes it into the requirements of the diocese. Some dioceses are different. They pay X number of dollars for a mass, X number of dollars for commuting time. Sometimes it's a flat rate. So that kind of depends on what the diocese advocates at the time. Any other questions?
I have a question, Richard, on that.
Mm-hmm.
Rest periods. I mean, just a general question to throw out because maybe others have gotten similar questions. A long time ago, I got a question from somebody asking if they could not take their breaks and leave early. Like, I don't want to take my 15-minute break, but I want to save my 2 15-minute breaks and leave half an hour early.
That comes up every once in a while, especially with meal breaks. Now we're getting into an employee relation situation, okay? That may be fine, and that may be the employee's thought process. But, and everything is fine if you allow that. However, trust me, as soon as something happens and you have to take adverse action against that employee, that will come back and bite you. The employee will come, well, wait a minute, I've worked through my break periods, I worked through lunch periods, and you haven't complained about it, and now you owe me. And trust me, that would come up very easily. If the employee has kept records of that, then they can come back to the Department of Labor, and the Department of Labor normally say, okay, this is what the employee says, this is what the records show, you better get your checkbook out. So definitely would stay away from that 100%. Other questions?
Well, and I wonder if I can buzz in here. I'm sorry, Richard. I'm sorry for interrupting. I wonder if I can buzz in on that. In the parish, we often have people who are required to be manning a station until a certain time. So maybe the parish office is open until 4:30,
Sure.
and we need someone
As
greeting
long,
visitors, answering the phones, and so on. And so, like, even more so, we would have to say, like, well, no, you can't leave half an hour early. This position is required to be here until a certain time at the end of the day.
as long as you pay them, not a problem. That's the key to the whole thing. As long as you pay them for their time, not a problem. That's when you start cutting corners and so forth, that becomes a problem. But if you require a person to work a full 8 hours and they have to work through the lunch period, as long as you pay them, that's not a problem. That answer your question? Okay, any other questions? Record keeping. This is a very important thing. And like they say, the job is not finished until the paperwork is done. Okay. Now, there are some record keeping requirements according to the Act. Employee records must be kept, meaning the full name, social security number, standard documentation, regular hourly rate of pay, hours worked each work week, including overtime, when the work week begins, total daily, weekly, straight time earnings, total overtime for a week, additions to or deductions from wages, date of payment, and pay period covered. These are all very important records that must be kept. One last item is time cards for exempt employees is a requirement. That is a legal document that is required for any non-exempt employee. I normally recommend that for exempt employees as well, primarily to manage vacation and sick leave time, but the main requirement is for non-exempt employees. Now, to get a little closer, time card is a problem sometimes because that's not enforced. Sometimes people will sign in at 8 a.m., sign out at 4:30 p.m., that's it. That's not the requirement. The requirement is to clock in, clock out for lunch, clock back in after lunch, and then clock out at the end of the day. That's the actual requirement for time cards. This is something that you will run into if you haven't already. Then if that's the case, those of you in the management positions need to correct that because that's not following the law. Questions?
Richard, is this an inappropriate time or an appropriate time to raise the question about paid sick leave policy and paid parental leave policy?
No, I guess we can talk about that, although we'll be covered as we move on with the other sessions. But um, the paid parental leave is something that's required based on the individual uh, organization. And not all of them are the same. Some of them will pay paid parental. Now, family medical leave is a different matter. That's a matter of law. Okay,
Oh,
there's no that's a requirement that's dictated by law. Nursing requirements as well. But parental leave, that's something that's a local requirement based on what the requirements of the diocese are. It's the same as bereavement leave, for example. Most parishes or more dioceses will provide some form of bereavement leave, be it 1, 2, 3, or 5 days. It depends on the situation, but that's open to whatever the diocese provides. It's not a strict requirement according to the act.
We do have a new state law coming up on paid family and medical leave in the state starting 2026, but you all should be aware of that already. We've been talking about it, so
Yeah, and again, that varies by state.
yeah.
Okay, there's a lot of different requirements that I'm covering here that are superseded by state law, and that's the first thing. But again, this is their minimum that we're covering today.
thank
I
you.
have, I
I'm
have
sorry?
some questions about timesheets, if we could go back to that.
Sure.
Um, so I have some employees who work maybe 1 day a week. They come in, they clean the bathrooms, do their house cleaning, whatever, and then that's it.
Mhm.
However, our payroll is run just once a month. Is it
Mhm.
necessary that they have a separate timesheet each week? Or
Yes.
can they do one?
Yes, that is, there's no strict rule that says that, but it's advisable to make sure that you document that by week. That's the record keeping requirement. Now, is this person an on-call person?
No,
What are they, part-time?
yes.
Okay, yeah, either way, the best way to do it is make sure they fill out that time card whenever they come in, whether they come in 1 day a week or 2 days a week, whatever. And in the end, because that way you can document how much time that person has worked and what you paid them.
Okay. Another question, for our liturgist who works off-site, but does work for, the various parishes and whatnot. He more or less makes his own spreadsheet is his time sheet. Is that
Okay.
acceptable?
This is altogether a different aspect, and we'll get into that. This is now brings us into the subject of independent contractor. Okay. That is always a very risky and very an aspect that can be abused very easily if it's not controlled. Let me get into that a little bit. If you have a person that you've hired as a liturgist, normally you hire them either as part-time or as on-call person. The requirements for documenting time cards the same as anybody else. That's a non-exempt position, unless of course they're a professional certified person, but they have to fill out a time card, clock in, claim out for whatever hours they put in at the parish. Now, if they're off-site, now this is a different situation because that's awful difficult to control. No, that brings us into the subject of whether that person is actually an independent or should be an independent contractor versus an employee. Okay. Now, there's a difference between a plain musician or liturgist and independent contractor. So we'll get into that a little bit, but how do you handle that right now?
He's an hourly employee.
An hourly employee, okay, but he provides services for other parishes?
Yes.
Okay, so the only obligation he has is to you. Now, how he works with the other parishes is up to that parish to determine because now they've hired what is considered an independent contractor, not an
Well,
employee.
Okay, and maybe I stated that wrong. He's employed by our parish,
Mhm.
and then the other parish, he submits all of his time to us. And if he does any other work for the other parishes,
Okay,
that's just all on us. We equally split his time.
I
It
see,
just
okay.
Doesn't
all
matter.
right, Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, no, that's something that's not unusual. However, the problem is making sure that the time cards are filled out correctly and are submitted to you so that you could have the visibility to those. So it's a tickly situation, but it can be done and has been done. But the important thing is to make sure that the time card or what a individual enters on their time card is accurate. And the way you can verify that is have somebody at that parish sign off on that time card or verify that the fact that they did work those hours that they submitted to you. That's what I would recommend,
Okay,
but it's not unacceptable. Let's put it that way. It's doable.
okay, thank you.
Okay, makes sense?
Mhm.
Okay.
And Richard, while we're on record keeping, a question is, what's the retention period for non-exempt time cards?
Normally, the exemption period is for time cards is it's 7 years or the duration of the employee's work time. But normally it's 7 years in any capacity. No, let me get into another realm here. I'm a great believer in keeping records because you always have other factors that come in. I have personally experienced where the Department of Labor or was filed with the Employment Opportunity Commission, and we had to come up with 12 years of time cards. Okay, this is unusual, but it's not unheard of. So my position normally is if you have an employee, you keep the time cards as long as that employee is working for you. But that's your call. The requirement is not that much. 7 years is normally the required time. Questions? I hope that answers it.
Yes.
Okay, anything else? Okay, moving on. Posting requirements. The intent is to make sure all employees are aware of the rights of the employee. Now, these are the posters that you see and hopefully are located in each of your parishes or locations where they're plain visibility to the employees. Again, the intent is to make sure all employees are aware of the rights as employees. There are federal and state posters which talk about minimum wage, overtime pay, child labor, OSHA, and so forth requirements. Enforcement must be posted in a conspicuous place where employees can readily see the posters. Normally, these would be lunchrooms or where the employees congregate. The requirements do change periodically, so they must be monitored. All these posters, either statewide or federal-wise, do change, and they should be reviewed. Now, one important point is, you have a lot of people that try to sell posters to you. You'll see tons of people that advertise that. You don't have to pay for anything. These are all public record. They can be downloaded, except it takes time to do it. An easy way to do it is to attach onto a bona fide vendor that covers all these areas, particularly including your state. So, but these posters are important. They're part of the requirement. Any questions on that? Okay, now we're going to get into briefly the focus items. And I'd like to spend about 10 minutes on these at the most if we can rush through them. So focus item, wages, non-exempt employees. Again, time must be accounted for correctly on a time card. It's a legal document. Most people don't believe that, but it is a legal document. Changes must be acknowledged by the employee. And rounding is allowed. Changes, if you have a time card that needs to be changed, that employee should acknowledge it. Normally, it's acknowledged by, if it's a paper time card, initial a time card. If you're on electronic time cards, normally the preventer has an area where you can make the entry saying that you agree to that change. Rounding basically means you round off a time to the nearest quarter hour. So if an employee comes in at 8:10, it's rounded off to 8:15. Or if it's comes in at 5 minutes before, it's rounded off to 8 o'clock. Employee must be paid the required wages. Now, very important, no payments under the table. Okay, an employee needs to be paid so that the required taxes must be deducted. Every once in a while, we run into the situation where it's very convenient for us to hire somebody who has a fantastic price, as well qualified, so it's easy to pay him by check. And that's okay on a limited basis. However, if you go beyond $600 in a year, then all bets are off. You need to make sure that you either deduct the proper taxes or issue what you call a 1099 form so that the employee or the person can file their taxes correctly. Any questions on that? Overtime must be recorded and must be paid. Now, very important, compensatory time is not allowed except in government agencies. Sometimes in many organizations in our dioceses, we find that compensatory time is given to employees. That's illegal. It's not legal except in government agencies. So if you're in the habit of giving compensatory time, don't do it. Not allowable. Vacation must be accurately calculated and paid as required. Any questions on this?
Yes, Richard. Sorry if I can buzz in here.
Sure.
Thank you. I appreciate that. In a number of parishes that I've been at in the past, there's been violation, like in my, the first month, you kind of look at all the records, where are things at, and you find these things. I
Mhm.
mean, other than referring to our diocese HR manager, which is, of course, a great place to start, anything that you would say are red flags, like we need to contact a government agency and report on our own parish, anything like that, where like, hey, we found this going on, and how do we go about correcting some of these things, like especially just
Is
anything that might be legal trouble for the parish.
is your question, should it be reported? Is that what you're saying?
Uh, in essence, yes. Like, are there certain
Yeah.
benchmarks where we need to say, like, beyond
Tec-
asking the diocese for help in correcting it, where we
tec-
need to report this?
Yeah, technically it should be reported. Um, Again, and I'm not going to say that you have to, but by law you should report it. And the only problem is you're going to have to pay the consequences of that. But in order to report it, then you have to go back and file, for example, 1099 forms if that's what's required. And then that person needs to be advised because they will probably have to file an amended tax return for compensatory time or for any time that's where the payments were not correct. Now, compensatory time, quite frankly, I would say just stop it. That's a very difficult one to prove and to report to the Department of Labor because that could be very inaccurate. They probably would not look at it if you reported it. So my word on that one personally is just stop doing it. Does that make sense?
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions?
And just to be clear, Richard, the compensatory time, you're saying stop it for non-exempt employees if you do that.
That's correct. Yes. Yeah. Compensatory time again is not allowable in the church. It's allowable in federal and state governments, but not in the church.
And again, I'm being specific about to emphasize the non-exempt.
I'm sorry?
I'm being specific about exempt and focusing on that applies to non-exempt employees.
That applies, no, this applies to non-exempt because normally that's where that comes in.
Right.
For exempt personnel, if they're fully exempt, it doesn't matter how much time they take off. Okay, and that works into the time taken and so forth that you can control. So if it's an exempt person and that person needs to take time off, it's not compensatory time. It's still need to pay them. However, non-exempt brings it in a different realm. They need
Yeah.
to. Make
Yeah, I
sense?
guess it makes sense, but I think the point I'm making, and again, not to belabor any one point too long, an exempt employee who said, let's, for example, say works all day Sunday and and someone says, well, take Monday as comp time for all that time you worked on Sunday. They're not submitting vacation time. They're not submitting personal time. They're not submitting sick time, and they're not working a lick on Monday.
Well, now you're getting into a situation, you can adjust a work week. Okay. So if you got a person that says, okay, next week you come in only 4 days versus 5, that's adjustment of the work weeks. It's not a problem as long as that's within the same pay period. So that's not a problem at all.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So that's an easy one.
Wow.
Compensatory time, again, for non-exempt is where they work, an exceptional number of hours, and then we need to give them time off corresponding to the number of hours they work. That's unacceptable. Now,
No, I
the
understand.
other, yeah. Now, for exempt employees, now there's a different situation. They may come in. May have an exempt employee who you've already paid, you know what is it, but however, you're expecting some additional work to be done, something that's totally out of the ordinary. There, what I would recommend is the consideration of paying that employee what you call mission pay or special pay for that particular project. It's project-based versus an extension of their pay. And an example for that, if you're in a parish and you have an exempt employee that you're going to assign to do the parish census, for example, and go out and beat the bushes or whatever. That's something that's normally not normally required of their job, but needs to be done. So that's where you might want to get into a special pay situation. And that's entirely valid as long as you make the proper deductions from the FICA standpoint. Okay with that? That makes sense? Okay, any other questions? Okay, employee travel and meals. Travel. Again, when travel time is integral to perform the employer's job, it must be treated as working time. Again, I mentioned this earlier, I'm not going to belabor that, but commuting time means to and from work. That's not compensable. Travel between job sites is hours work. I think I mentioned that earlier, and it can be an opportunity for abuse or irregularity. That's something that, normally you need to be careful because that's something that can be abused if you're not careful. Meals, not compensated if 30 minutes or longer, an employee relieved their duties. If the employee is allowed to eat at desk, time is work time. Now, one important aspect at the bottom is substitution of expenses is not allowed. Now, going back to the meals, if the person is on travel time or travel extensively, normally it's customary to pay the employees' meals as long as they're reasonable and actual. However, let's say employee A goes to Los Angeles and decides to stay at Nellie's place. Okay. Then he says, well, I'm going to give Aunt Nellie $100 for keeping me over a couple of days. That is not allowed. That's a substitution of expenses. Okay. Anytime that a person travels, they need to be reasonable in actual expenses versus substitution of expenses. Any questions on that? Okay. Independent contractor must qualify, cannot be just anybody. Okay, an independent contractor normally is an individual who should be a business person who lends himself or herself out to provide a certain service. Example of this are bookkeepers, IT persons, somebody who you would hire that doesn't necessarily work on your premises 8 hours a day. This is a person who has normally a specialized type of talent that you need. You need it, but you don't need it on an ongoing basis. What I would recommend is make sure that that person does qualify as an independent business person to be able to vent himself or herself off. Any questions on that? The point here is you cannot just pick out a parishioner and says, I'm going to hire you as an independent contractor. Not allowable. Okay. Questions on that? I'm sure you run into it because we run into that very frequently in any place that I've ever been. Okay, just be careful with that one. An organization can only control the results of work, not the means by which accomplished. If you have an independent contractor that qualifies, you cannot control the results of work, only the means by which accomplished. Payment is via an invoice submitted periodically by the contractor. An independent contractor, the concept is that person submits an invoice to you, you pay that contractor based on that invoice. Now, in the course of business, you cannot control that person, such as telling him when to come into work, or telling him when he could leave, or telling him in detail what you want him to do. That takes it out of the realm of an independent contractor. That brings it into the realm of an actual employee, which is a dangerous situation. It is advisable to have a contract in place, which outlines the contractor responsibilities and the organization's responsibilities. Some of these would have such items such as liability insurance, termination clause, and very important is the scope of work required. So typically, if you have an independent contractor, you have an arm's length relationship with that person. You tell them what they want to do in general terms through that scope of work, but you do not monitor that on an ongoing basis. What you expect is the end result and depend on that individual's integrity to provide that for you as an independent business person. This subject brings out a lot of questions. Any questions on your part?
I get a lot of questions about this. Oh, we just pay them a stipend or we pay them on 1099. I think to avoid the complexities of the employee status, but if you ever have a question, if which kind of category they fall into, me or Jessica or Brittany Priggy in the finance office is also really good at knowing kind of which is which on this too. So we're always here to help assist you with that classification. It can be tricky.
Yeah, Bailey, you brought up a very interesting point by what you just said. First of all, in any church environment, the word stipend should be taken out of your vocabulary. Okay, stipends are applicable only for priests and possibly deacons, depending on the situation. But nobody should be paid on a stipend. That's a misconception. An independent contractor, again, should be paid. It's a payable based on that invoice that the independent contractor provides. Okay. And it's up to the individual to pay their own taxes and so forth. That's the good part about an independent contractor if they do the good job for you. Questions? Okay.
Oh, I got one real quick.
Yeah, look,
Just kind of brought up already there with say musicians. We've got some that make over the $600 a year mark by playing at masses, $50 a time. Should we actually have them as employees and basically every musician be an employee?
you have a musician that's an independent contractor?
Well, we pay the stipend. That's how we classify it.
Again, no stipend is not applicable. Nobody should be paid a stipend, no such word. You have to deduct applicable taxes for anybody that you pay compensation to.
Yeah, Luke, a lot of the musicians, you're telling them when to be there, what to play, all of those things. And so most of the time they're probably going to be an employee rather than an independent contractor.
Exactly. That's what I would definitely recommend, that you firm it up by make him either a part-time employee, which is a new, or an on-call employee. That's normally the better play because you don't necessarily need them all the time. But bottom line, that person needs to be paid like same as everybody else under the payroll system.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, independent contractor, again, the Department of Labor looks at this very closely. In case of an investigation by the Department of Labor, the Wage and Hour Division considers several factors. Number one, the amount of the contractor's investment in facilities and equipment. How much does this independent contractor bring forth to the parish or to the organization? The nature and degree of control by the firm. This means, is the organization dictating to the contractor what they should and shouldn't do? What is but the permanency of a relationship? Is this something that's been going on for years, or is it just a temporary relationship? And the extent to which services are an integral part of the recipient's business. In other words, if we have an independent contractor who relies solely on your particular organization for their livelihood, now that brings it into a different focus, which means that probably it probably should be an employee versus an independent contractor. The amount of the individual initiative, judgment, and foresight in open market competition with others. In other words, does this individual make himself or herself available to other organizations to provide the same services they provide for you? And again, the degree of independence. Is this a sole income source? Do they do they depend solely on your organization for their pay? Questions? Exempt
Yes.
employee? I'm sorry.
Yeah, there was a couple here. Let me see. Just trying to look at the contract. Are they suggestions for the contractor about liability? And I don't know what else you had there about the liability. And just going back to the contractor and what you were expecting, a liability insurance and the termination clause, are all those necessary? Or are they just suggestions?
That's very, very strongly suggested for the simple reason that you need to be able to say how, under what condition you can terminate that contract or that agreement. I call it an agreement versus a contract. But in all relationships, you ask that independent contractor to do a certain level of work. If that independent contractor's, in your opinion, does not reach that level of satisfaction that you want, you need to find a place to be able, or a reason to be able to cut that contract off. And normally, it's a two-way situation with a 30-day notice by either the independent contractor or the organization that's he's subcontracted by, says that without any questions asked, that relationship can be terminated as long as there's a period of notification.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Now, liability insurance is a different situation. Now, normally that's why the reason for an agreement, because under normal circumstances, you ask that independent contractor to provide liability insurance to make sure that if is injured on the premises, that liability insurance covers himself, and also workers' compensation. That person is covered by workers' compensation. So there's a distinct reasons for having an agreement for an independent contractor, cover all those. Otherwise, the parish can be liable in case of an accident or some other instance that might be unfavorable.
so you're saying it's required?
I would, in my opinion, yes, it would be required. Yes,
All right.
although there's nothing that's written that says that's absolute requirement by any law that I'm aware of. Yeah.
And here's a question. Can the musician be paid per mass?
Per mass, yes. Again, that depends on the agreement, but again, it brings us into the realm of the agreement between the parish and that individual. Again, it's still dependent on how many masses that person says. So if you pay that for one mass once a month, for example, you pay that individual $50, not a problem. Okay. 5 times 12 though is $600. Now you're getting into a 1099 form. But yes, you can do it. Again, the best way to do it is to hire that person as an on-call or a part-time employee. That way you can adequately deduct the applicable taxes from her pay.
All right, Amy, I hope that takes care of your question.
Okay. Although classification can favor the employer, care is needed, okay? And that's talking about, again, exempt employees. Title on the job description is not sufficient to pass the duties test. In other words, you can attach any title you want, but unless they pass the duties test, that is not valid. A wording in the job description should reflect exact duties required. And we'll get into the job descriptions here in the next session, but the wording for an exempt employee should be commensurate with that position. Work directly related to the management or general operations of the parish or the school, and examples are set work schedules, represent the pastor or principal in a selected area, provides input regarding promotions, etc., must be again able to exercise discretion and independent judgment. Again, those are the requirements for an exempt employee. Creative creative professionals, musicians, guitar players or accompanists at celebrations do not qualify. Person must have specialized training, such as a Juilliard School of Music or some university school of music, must be paid as a non-exempt employee hourly. Can pay on a fee basis, but must equal at least minimum hourly wage. Similar to the question that came up earlier. Questions on that? Agency personnel, once in a while we have to contract through an agency. Care is very necessary in dealing with temporary agency personnel. Personnel employees are employees of the agency, not the organization. So if you hire somebody that's a temp, for example, bring him in to do work as a receptionist or whatever else, that person is the employee of the temporary personnel agency, not you. The relationship has to be what you call arm's length. In other words, you cannot treat that person the same as you would a regular employee. A regular employee, you include him in department meetings, employee outings, parties, and so forth. That brings it closer to the person being an employee. Any reviews, appraisals, or reprimands are the responsibility of the agency manager. Now, the bottom line is very important because the risk is in establishing what you call a joint employment relationship. Joint employment relationships means that all of a sudden you're the employer the same as that agency, temporary agency. So you share responsibilities for whatever the employee does. Now, the other part of it is if you have the employee, rather a temporary employee that all of a sudden feels that, I've been here 5 years or 2 years now, although my temporary agency is this, I work for the Diocese of St. Cloud and they treat me the same as any regular employee. I'm invited to all the department meetings. I'm including in making decisions. Therefore, I feel I'm an employee. So everything is fine until something goes haywire. And then that employee says, you know what, St. Cloud, you're mistreating me. You're not considering me as an employee. And I think I am an employee. Therefore, I'm going to appeal to the Department of Labor. Guess what? Now you have an employee. Okay. So that's the downside of not having that arm's length relationship in place. Questions on that? This is important because a lot of us on occasion do hire temporary employees through a temp agency. Okay, Fair Labor Standards violations, consequences of FLSA violations, legal actions by employees, that's always a liability or a possibility. Legal action by the Secretary of Labor is entirely possible depending on what they find. Individual managers can be held personally liable. And this is the scary part. Fines up to $10,000 and imprisonment up to 6 months for repeat offenders. Willful or repeat violations up to $1,000 per employee. Civil penalty, $10,000 for violation of child labor laws, and repeated violations could result in jail time. The following is not general knowledge, but we did have some years ago a diocese where the Department of Labor came down very hard because of repeated violations. This is a large archdiocese, by the way, not generally known. We don't talk about other particular, but but suffice it to say that we are all in a position and can be held liable if we're not careful with this. So it's very important that we follow the guidelines established by the Department of Labor. Questions? In summary, organizations need to review all employees to make sure they are appropriately classified. Employees must be classified accurately. It's important to follow the law and avoid liability and possible fines, avoid personal liability, which is possible, maintain good records, and adhere to the law promotes justice in the workplace, means equitable treatment and non-discriminatory treatment. Basically, that's my presentation, folks. Any questions, anything that we've covered up to this point? Okay, now, in the last few minutes, I will not take too many minutes now. All of you received the Santa Margarita story. I'm assuming you've had a chance to read it. So very quickly, this is open forum for opinions. And I sent to Bailey, I think we sent out the exercise. So we, Father Tony now has been Santa Margarita for 2 months. And in the spirit, he has volunteered challenges which cause him some concern, and he's not sure how he should handle them. Okay. First of all, number one, Father has encountered some resistance from Mrs. Ramirez. Remember, Mrs. Ramirez is the old-time parish secretary. She was very fond of Father Tim, and she didn't like this young punk priest coming here and telling her what to do because that is not something she had been experiencing. So he asked her to please arrange for a meeting of the pastoral council and the finance councils. Father Tim had always told him this is something she always handled for him. When he asked Mrs. Ramirez, she said this is something she never did and said he would have to do it himself. Scenario B, he asked her about who handled the parish collections, expecting her to say there was a collection team. She answered that this she did herself, that she would take the collection from the safe, count it, and make the weekly deposit herself. When he questions whether this was wise, her response was that this is the way it's always been done. And if he did not like it, he could do it himself. C is the posted office hours were 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. with the office being closed from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. for lunch. He noticed that Mrs. Ramirez did not have a specific time to come into work, nor did she abide by the stated lunch hours. She would come in at different hours, some days at 9, sometimes 9:30. She often came in between 9:30 and 10. When he questions her about that, she said that Father Tim allowed her to come in whenever she wanted to. And D, Father Tony overheard her speaking to one of the parishioners saying that she did not like this new pastor, that he really did not know what he was doing, and that she wished Father Tim were still there. She said Father Tim never questioned what she did. She felt that Father Tony did not like her or trust her. So, the first question that I have, and this is open forum for whoever wants to render an opinion. What is your opinion of Mrs. Ramirez's response to Father Tony in scenario A? That says he asked her to arrange for a meeting, and she says that this is something that she never did, said he would have to do it himself. What's your opinion? If I don't hear from, I'm going to call on somebody very quickly here. Bethany, what is your opinion?
I bet, Richard, I bet, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. Which part do you want an opinion on?
Number one, what's the opinion Mrs. Ramirez's respond to Father Tony in scenario A, where he asked her to arrange for meetings of the Pastoral Council and Finance Council? Father Tim told him this is something she always handled. But then when he asked Mrs. Ramirez, she said this is something she never did and said he would have to do it himself.
Was it in her job description? Because I think that's what I would fall back to. If it was in her job description, then she's responsible for that, I would assume.
We
don't
don't know
know.
that. We don't know that.
Oh,
there's
we don't
nothing-
know that?
No, we don't
Oh.
have made any mention of a job description for her yet.
Oh, well, first off, I would say that she's probably in the wrong for even telling the priest he has to do it himself. But I don't know, but that would be my assumption. She shouldn't be bossing around a priest. That's his job. I mean, he's the boss. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm very shy.
Yeah, these are all unanswered questions. They're all troublesome questions. Okay, I'm going to ask this again, another question, but somebody else willing to give their opinion. What do you think Father Tony should do? Should he reprimand her for lying to him? Anybody else?
I guess
Well, I think
my
this
perspective, I
is,
don't know that she's lying. I mean, Father Tim might have, a misunderstanding of what's happening too. To me, I don't know who's telling the truth or who's lying. So to reprimand, Ms. Ramirez at this point, I think is a little premature. There's a lot of things we don't know. Like we don't know her job description, as Bethany mentioned.
Right. Yeah, I think this is the point where, like Bethany said, now you go back to the job description and see if there's anything before you
Yeah.
attack each other again.
Okay, good. Good answer. Yeah, actually, it's very difficult to take any action at this point because you don't know a whole lot other than what she mentioned. Okay, and the next question, should he order her to do what he asked her to?
Not if you want to build a good relationship going forward.
Okay, now we're getting into the employee relations aspect.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's already not in good graces with her. So to order her to do that puts another nail in his coffin, right? Anybody else an opinion? Okay, the final question is on this one here is, how do you think Father Tony should handle this situation? What would be your overall recommendation?
Call Bailey.
Pardon, Carl Bailey?
Oh, Bailey.
That's an excellent response, by the way. I agree. Because you run into this very frequently. So call Bailey is an excellent response in my opinion. Okay. Now, what in your opinion of how Mr. Ramirez handles the weekly collection in scenario B? How is this money handled in your parish? Is that an acceptable procedure? Now remember, she's counting, she's doing everything. Opinion?
That would need to be changed. You can't have just one person counting it and then depositing it. There has to be some control procedures put in place there.
Yeah, very risky, unacceptable. And this is has the makings of embezzlement, without a doubt, right?
And I think it's important to make sure you let her know that it's really for her safety to have, those procedures put into place. And in our situation, as a Diocese of St. Cloud, that clearly has been put in place for us. So there's a policy that you could take out if Mrs. Ramirez happens to be working for the diocese.
Hannah says, no, we have 6 groups of 4 people each. It's laid out very well. The bank value needs to be, and that's the correct procedure to follow. So again, yeah, Mrs. Ramirez is not doing it the way it should be. A lot of risk involved. Unfortunately, you see this every once in a while in parishes where you have one person doing all the counting, going to the bank and so forth. Not good. So, okay, so your recommendation would be to Father Tony to review the procedures with her? Is that what you're saying?
Or I think write some procedures if there aren't any that are written down or exist.
Okay. Now, what about Mrs. Ramirez's tardiness and coming in? The following question to that is, should Father Tony terminate Mrs. Ramirez based on what he's seen already? Anybody? I'm seeing the Amanda's says against is there a policy regarding attendance and so forth? I missed the other one. Anyways, should Ms. Ramirez be terminated? Yes or no?
My opinion would be no, it's too early for that because he hasn't really given her his expectations and given her a chance to meet those expectations. I think there needs to be a conversation first.
Anybody disagree? Okay, what recommendations again would you make to Father Tony?
I think take her out to coffee and have a heart to heart.
Okay, that's one possibility. Right? In a non-threatening way, I would assume. Yeah. Okay, next to the last one is, how do you think Father Tony should handle the situation scenario B? Should he ignore this? Father Tony feels he should just ignore. He heard this is to not create waves. Do you agree? This is where he made the comment, overheard Mrs. Ramirez speaking to one of the parishioners, saying she did not like the new pastor. What would you do?
If I were the pastor, what I would do? Is that the question?
Yeah, what do you think Father
Yeah,
Tony should
I
do?
think how important it is to build a relationship.
Okay,
I like the idea someone said, go have coffee,
okay.
talk about it.
Anybody else? Anybody other opinions? Okay, let me just give you my personal opinion. This is a difficult situation for Father Tony. He's brand new. He's only been there 2 months. He's gotten all kinds of pushback from Mrs. Ramirez, who has not been used to being managed for so many years. So it is very difficult for him to take any sort of action right now, and I think all of you touched on it. We don't know if there's a job description in place. We don't know if there's any type of a performance requirements in place for him. And even if there was obviously he has not reviewed that to find out. So there's a lot of vagaries or a lot of differences in this that could put him in trouble if all of a sudden he decided to terminate Mrs. Ramirez. Okay, now again, things to consider if that's an option. She is over the 40 years old. You're getting into a subject of discrimination. She is a minority, another aspect to consider. So there's all kinds of things working against Father Tim and Father Tony in taking any type of action. However, in the future, something has to be done. Okay. And I think all of you have an idea what that is. And we'll be covering that in the next session, which is performance management as to what we feel should be done. So we'll be covering that aspect. So I think we all have an idea, but the important part is you have to start from A and go to Z versus jumping in the middle. This is where once in a while we find managers that find themselves in hot water immediately when they try to enforce policies, whether they're real or whether they're in writing, without any type of groundwork done, any type of relationship establishment and so forth. We'll get into that in the employee relations aspect as well, because that's a very important. Any questions or any feelings on what we've covered so far from anybody, good or bad? Okay, I don't have anything else to discuss. The next session, we're going to be getting into employment, which is a very important aspect. So now we're going to be building up the scenario, and part of that will be for Father Tony as well. So we're going to be talking about the employment process, what to look for. We're going to be talking about reviewing job descriptions and the required elements of job descriptions. So we're getting into some detail on that hopefully will answer some of your questions. Now, some of you, I gather, are very experienced, probably have second nature to you already. So consider that a refresher, but I think that's a very important part. One of the things we miss as managers, particularly in the workplace in the church, is not hiring the right people. And that's the beginning of problems. So we want to avoid that. So we'll be talking about that at length next time. Meanwhile, there's another scenario that I'll be sending Bailey to send to you regarding Mrs. Ramirez and Father Tony. So we'll be reviewing that in part the next session. It takes us a little bit more detail into Father Tony's career and experiences with Mrs. Ramirez. Any questions on anybody on anything? Okay, Regina, I'll turn it back over to you. I don't have anything else unless you do.
No, great participation. I loved your engagement. So thank you for your interaction. And Richard, thank you for your great presentation. And Bailey will be sending you the slide deck. So it'll be a great reference for the class. So Bailey, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. We'll see you all next week, same time, same place. I know our priests, I don't know that they'll be able to join us next week. They'll be in Arrowwood at their clergy conference, but I will be sure to fill you in on everything that you miss, those of you who are priests, but the rest of you, or most of the rest of you, will see you next week.
In all fairness, this next part will be applied very much so the administrators or the business managers and office managers versus the priest directly. He's a final arbiter and the final decision, but the process itself is the important part. So if they're not there, if you clue them in, that'll be good.
Perfect.
Okay. All right.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Yes.
Richard, can I ask you a question after everybody's left?
Sure.
Okay,
Stay
thank
on.
you. Sorry. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I won't shut down till you're finished, Richard.
That's fine.
Okay.